people about my work. I love, the opportunity to have conversations around this subject, which has for ever and ever and ever been a very taboo subject. So there is so much about death that we really don't know much about because our culture has pushed it aside. So I'm hoping that tonight really can be more of a conversation rather than me talking to you. It's my hope that everyone has seen the film, but even if you haven't, perhaps there's questions around this subject. In the realm of death and dreaming really is a personal exploration of the big question: does consciousness continue after death? And the reason I chose that subject as the first film to do in the trilogy is because I think it's a foundational question. What we think and what we believe happens when we die has everything to do with how we live and how we want to be cared for at the end of our life. It's a very different set of thought processes if you think it's totally lights out. This is it, we get one shot. When you die, it's over, boom, done, dead, do whatever you want with the body. And it's quite a different one if you believe that there's some kind of continuity of consciousness that takes place. And so I think that all humans really should have an opportunity to contemplate the big question, because not only is it rich and full of generative questions, more questions I find than answers, but also because it really makes a difference to how we can live our life. And we can talk about those things. So I'm just curious if have people here had a chance to see the film? Do we have a hand raising mechanism on there? Yeah, just your own hands are good. Okay, great. And were there any questions or thoughts that arose out of your watching it? Yes, Karen.
So I just have a comment. It's not really a question.
Yeah.
But I really was very moved by the folks who talked about their near-death experiences, because I as well have had a near-death experience. And so that was very comforting for me. And when I talk to people who have had death or near-death experiences, there's a surreal comfort in that. So thank you for that. Thank you for the whole film. It was really, really special.
Well, you're welcome. And Karen, I'm curious, what your experience has been. I've spoken to many people who've had NDEs, and I think what I keep with the whole When You Die project, I keep coming up against, this whole social issue of pushing death away, so that when someone has had an NDE, there isn't validation for it necessarily. I think things are changing now, but I'm curious, in your experience, when it happened, what kind of a support or no support did you have for processing your experience?
I was a senior at Syracuse University, and really had no support. I do remember my mother telling me that the doctor, so I had an IVP in a doctor's office, so which is a sort of study with some dye, and it was the dye that I was highly allergic to. So I was in his office, not in the hospital, and he called, in Syracuse, and he called my mother and said something like, I really had a really awful and confusing and scary day today. Your daughter almost died. And my mother's response was, well, I almost just died by you telling me this. So that was a really weird, I mean, I felt for this poor doctor, but it was just kind of a bizarre situation. And then no support. I guess I did see him, and he sort of relayed the same bizarre thing to me. And I just went through the next few months wondering if I was going to die again, which is a really, that was going to happen again. And then for a number of years, whenever I would be faced with getting an injection, I would be very fearful and scared. And I remember a doctor was insisting that I have some sort of shot, and he was berating me I told him that I had a shot that almost killed me, and he was berating me for not taking, oh, come on, grow up and take this shot. And he was really, it was a terrible position to be in with this supposed medical person who's supposed to help me heal. So I had no support. However, personally, the experience and what came out of my wondering if I was going to die and going through that for a while, but the experience taught me how beautiful death is or could be, because my experience at the time was the most profoundly peaceful, relaxing experience I had ever felt. And it prepared me for the rest of my life. After I got over the fear of, possibly dying again, but that waned, after a certain amount of time, that kind of ended. So.
Right. Wow. Well, there's so much to just what you have just said about, well, I think medicine has come a long way.
Yes. Yeah.
No question about it, but how ill prepared many of our medical doctors, particularly of the older generation, are to deal with that. Because obviously your doctor was more scared for himself than you.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry that was your experience, for sure. It would be very different, I think, today.
Yeah, and it was a very long time ago, too.
Yeah.
Thank you for letting me share that. Thank you, everyone, for letting me share that, too.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah. You focused on Gary Fay is my name. You focused on continuity of consciousness, but you didn't spend a lot of time on the question of I am, or personal identity, and how that changes in that transitional period. Obviously, you lose your body, so all the things associated with your body and your normal, ordinary, your life experiences go away. You might have some memory, but you're clearly a different person. And so if the identification of who you are lies with your earthly time, that's got to be somewhat unsettling. I wanted to hear more about that part of it in terms of how people experience themselves, the whole I am question.
Yeah, that's a really good one. And I think that since we are all meditators here on this call, and I don't know how many of you self-identify as being Buddhist, but certainly in the Buddhist tradition, there's quite a body of knowledge around bardo and death, which is a whole conversation in itself. But I think that one thing that meditation does is loosens up a little bit of the I am, and through practice, you begin to sense something greater than I am, which is awareness, as kind of the ground of existence, you might say. And I think, with Andrew Holochek's interview, and he talks about the three bodies in a very general sense, which I really appreciated, because most of the people watching this film are not Buddhists, and they don't necessarily have the kind of relationship to their I am or ego as we might, our intense identification with our body. It is incredibly difficult to imagine ourselves without a body. And I think that was at the heart of what Andrew was saying about the three bodies, that, there's the coarse outer body that we're very attached to. And then there's a more subtle body, a dream body. So if anyone is familiar with lucid dreaming, this is the kind of reference point we have to body in our dreams. And then the more subtle body, which is no reference point to a subtle body or a coarse body. And that the more we can identify beyond the coarse body, the easier, in a certain sense, that transition of life into death can be. So I think what I did is I tried to point to it, but without being Buddhist, if you will. I am a Buddhist, and it is a very Buddhist film. And there's a lot that's in there that if you're more scholarly in your studies, you can see it. But it was really meant to open up conversations and to not get caught up in any particular philosophical or religious belief. So I don't know, Gary, if that is where you're going here, or if there's more you'd like to.
Yeah, it was what you said. I got that. It was more the shift in consciousness. Also, I was curious, just again, you had a limited focus on what you were trying to accomplish in this film, and again, it seemed to be addressed primarily for Buddhists. I have my own mystical tradition, but where does the idea of spiritual development come in terms of that transition? In other words, depending on where you were in your own soul evolution of consciousness, that would seem to me to alter that experience and transition.
That's a really great question. And I think that probably more in the third film, in a weird way, then that's sort of the inner aspect of dying. Kind of get into that more. It's that question of what's a good death. In a certain sense, that's what I hear you asking. Is that right?
Yes, partially, but I'm not even sure what a good death represents, depending on what what state of being you are, what state of evolution consciousness you are, and entering that thing. I mean, you can't change that at the end. You are whatever you become up to that point. It seems
Right. Right. Yeah, no, I agree with you that the idea of a good death, at first, when I was exploring this subject, I was really annoyed by the idea of a good death, because I felt like, isn't it enough? You've got to weigh a certain amount and you have to look a certain way, that now you've got to have a good death. It felt like just too much pressure.
right.
Like enough of that. But I think in talking to a lot of people who have worked, spent their careers working with people who are dying, and people in palliative care, which is pain management, not just death management. And I think that the answer to them is very clear about what makes a good death, is that people that have put their lives in order. They haven't left a lot of loose ends as far as their estates and wills and medical directives and those things, because it's a great kindness to our loved ones if those things are in order, and that have had a chance to reflect on their lives, and have some kind of meaning making with their lives, some kind of resolution. And if you've had the amazing good fortune of being able to say, I'm sorry, I forgive you, and I love you, then that's the jackpot of, tying everything up. So that when those things are in order, those really can put aside a lot of the regret and fear, and it makes it easier for people to let go, because this intense identification with our body makes it very difficult for us to let go in the end. So the more things are in order, the more ease one can have. Now, there are sudden deaths, and that's a whole nother thing that we could talk about. But generally speaking, for most of us, that we could, if we have the good fortune of living a long life, putting our house in order, those things can help. Now, you're asking an even more subtle question about spiritual development. And I had one palliative care doctor, hospice doctor, say to me, I don't know why some people seem to die easily and other people don't. She said, I had a patient who asked me, why do I have to have so much suffering? Why is it so difficult for me to die? What is that about? And she's like, I don't know what that's about, but there was something about his particular life stream that that's what it was. That's the culmination of his life, was in a not a comfortable death. It was a painful death. And in the end, he did let go and he did have some peace. But there was a long period that was very difficult for him.
Thank you.
And she said, but in contrast, I had another patient who was given a diagnosis of 6 to 8 months to live. And one day he just said, I'm going to die. I don't want any more food or water. Just go away. He put a wet towel over his eyes, and the next morning he was gone. Why was he able to do that? And neither of these people were, extraordinary religious people or spiritual people, but they're just that there is a spectrum. And I do think that spiritual practice and contemplation of these things contribute to a greater ease in letting go. But there are people who don't practice and don't have those big thoughts, and they're still able to let go. So it's kind of a mystery, us humans, we come into the world with a whole bunch of stuff, and each person is unique.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else out there with any? I will say, I have noticed that a lot of my Buddhist colleagues are terrified of death. There's sort of a strong feeling that, well, it's an irony, really, that somehow they're going to be chased around the bardos in the hell realms, and it's going to be completely torturous and terrifying. And of course, the great irony is, and these are friends of mine, 40 plus years practicing on a cushion. And I have to say that it kind of misses the point of meditation to think that way, because following the breath is releasing over and over and over again, and purifying, and it's a reminder of our own fundamental goodness and all of these other things. But somehow we forget that and are afraid. So probably no one on this call is like that, but I'm just going to throw that out there, because for many people, they practice so that when their end of life comes, they will be able to let go and go to a more pure realm, maybe.
Joe has a hand raised. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm wondering, because of your orientation in Buddhism and others on the call here, but have you studied other religions or indigenous traditions that also have given feedback to you on how other people experience the afterlife?
Mhm.
I guess my basic question is to what extent our cultural life, the venue we've been born in and educated in, affects our experience of the afterlife?
Yes, that is something that I have looked into a little bit. I wouldn't say I'm 100% expert in it because I think each tradition you could spend quite a bit of time going deeper and deeper. But even if you just look at near-death experiences, Raymond Moody is one of the great pioneers who's recorded thousands and thousands, and many researchers after him. There's a huge body of research on near-death experiences. And so many of them seem to follow a very, very similar, there's a tunnel, there's, loved ones come to greet you, so on and so forth. But if you look at near-death experiences in Hinduism, it's quite different than in Judeo-Christian tradition. If you look at near death in indigenous North American traditions, it's again quite different. Culture definitely plays a role in what in those situations, the set of experiences that happen seem to be shaped by culture. But what doesn't seem to be shaped by culture is a tremendous loving kindness. And that's very interesting to me, that is a playing field, if you will, of, near death is near death. We don't really know people that died. There's dialogues, and various traditions have certain people that have travel into the bardos and write stories, but really and truly, we don't really know what happens when we die. But there have been enough situations like NDEs, or what are called shared death experiences, and those can also be called end-of-life experiences, where people have dreams, or shared experiences of someone as they're dying. There's an indigenous woman, Lakota Sioux, who told me this story when her grandfather was dying, and he is an elder, very respected elder. And he asked her to put her arms around him as he was dying. And her consciousness went with him into the afterlife, and had a whole set of experiences that were quite beautiful. And at a certain point, he said, "You can't go any further, you have to go back." And so she went back, but she had this shared experience. And that is something we hear more and more about in indigenous cultures, but we're starting to hear more of them in Western culture as well, that they're kind of a set of things that have been happening, but hadn't been reported very widely. And in Jyoti's case, what she was saying was that it's not uncommon in Indian tradition that women help men die. That's something about giving them extra energy in order to go. So there is this cultural thing around that. And so that's another kind of body of stories that come forward, but always there's this kind of loving atmosphere, this really transcendent love. And I think that that's kind of interesting because it does dovetail with the psilocybin experiences and, Andrew Maslow's hierarchy, that these peak experiences can happen both as we are very much alive, but seem to be a component of end of life as well.
Thank you very much. I appreciate what you said. Yes. Mhm.
And Jane?
Jane, you're muted.
It's a bit off the topic, but maybe people around the Zoom room will find it helpful. And I'd really like to know if you have any research that reiterates what I'm about to say. I've been widowed twice. My first husband died at 23. My second husband died, and he was a 30-year serious meditator, not Tibetan meditation, transcendental meditation. And he died at 62 after having a near fatal heart attack at 40. And I was told, and he was told, that there was no way he was going to survive that. He lost half his heart. And the first husband was dying for 2 years with bone cancer. So they both suffered greatly. And people ask, and I was with them. I was actually in, the emergency room of Mount Sinai Hospital, ironically, in one of those little cubbies, 25 years apart, 2 different doctors, 2 different nurses, very similar experiences. So I can tell you, because people say, well, did your husband die suddenly? And I say, and my answer for both was yes and no. But I could tell you with both, who had very different experiences. One was actually by medical people. He collapsed at a huge party of 300 people, surrounded by many doctors and EMT people who came immediately. And one of them I overheard say, it would be best if he didn't survive because he's been brain dead. There's been no oxygen to the brain for at least 10 minutes, but the protocol is to take the person to the hospital, etc. So I was with them, I was holding their hands, and I would say at that moment, because I knew when the moment was there, it was very obvious as an observer and as the wife, they were both at peace. I saw it. All the pain, all the years of suffering, they were at peace. And I saw that in the face. They were gone, but they were at peace. Thank you for sharing that, Jane. That's really, really beautiful and hard. Steve?
Yes, I had a question, it was curiosity really. A lot of the near-death experiences sound very similar to what is described as enlightenment in a lot of cases. And I was just kind of wondering, you could talk about the similarity between the two, the relationship between the two. And I was even curious if Buddha, from what I gather, was near death at the time he achieved enlightenment. I was wondering if that was possibly a trigger for his enlightenment.
Well, that's an interesting question. I have no idea if that was a trigger for his enlightenment. I don't think it was a prerequisite for his enlightenment, though. I've never ever heard that in any tradition, but it's an interesting thought. Can
I make a comment about the Buddha?
Sure, John, please do.
He achieved enlightenment as a young man and then went on to live and teach until the age of 80. So his enlightenment was not triggered by his death. In any event, yeah, there was a big gap of about 60 years between the two.
No,
Well,
I was
For
just
sure, I think it was more that he hadn't eaten and he was skin and
Right.
bone.
Oh,
And
Right.
that part of the story.
Exactly. That was kind of where I was headed. Was I was wondering if
Actually,
that kind of triggered a near-death experience.
well, what actually, according to Trungpa Rinpoche, triggered it was his relaxing and taking milk and honey, and that the kindness that he did to his body was what set him up for achieving enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. According, in fact, this is in a reading that I think is coming up very soon, if not already, in the class that we're doing.
Yes, that was what brought the thought to my mind.
Okay.
I do want to go back to this idea of NDEs and enlightenment. I mean, I don't, who actually knows, but I don't think so. My gut on this is that they're not, because enlightenment is a stabilization of awareness, the thread, the continuity, if you will. And while I am quite confident that that is a truly loving space to be in, I think NDEs are a flavor of extraordinary kindness. They can be. There are scary NDEs, and I can talk about that. But the majority of them are these transcendent experiences, but they aren't stabilized for the person who's had them. If you've had an NDE, a lot of people who've had them, many of them then try to figure out how to stabilize that state in the dualistic body that we have as humans. By virtue of being human, we are by definition dualistic. We're always in contrast and in comparison to something. That's what our realm is all about. It's really about duality. And so our challenge of being able to bring this and that together is the path. And so for people who've had NDEs, these beautiful transcendent states, when they come out of it, they come into the density of this world. And it's not that the experience hasn't been stabilized. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, thank you very much.
What
Kurt
do you
has
mean
had
by,
his hand raised.
you mean by
Well,
stabilize? Sorry.
sorry, Kurt has had his hand raised for a while.
Thanks. Yeah, this was a comment from earlier on, actually in response to Karen Sue, that I lived with a partner for quite a while, and she had a near-death experience long before we were together, and it was classic. It was the classic experience of seeing loved ones and whatnot. And you were talking about support for that, and she had no support whatsoever. And this was in France at the time, and she really thought she was crazy. She had this amazing experience, but then when she came back, it was so depressing to come back. And it was her uncle that she saw on the other side, who said, "It's not your time. You've got work to do, and you have to go back." And she so reluctantly came back. But it wasn't until she moved to the States and she met Edgar Casey's grandson, and he said, "This is not. You're not the only one." And he really worked with her, and then she worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and it completely changed her life path. And also was spoken in the earlier around the cultural aspect of it. And she was raised Catholic, and part of that experience, she met Lord Bernadette, and her thought was that was her own psyche being able to construct some sense out of this. But it put her on this path, and she started the Bernadette Foundation with a huge volunteer base and working with death and dying, and had a couple hundred volunteers going into hospitals and working with people. And it was very clear for her to not direct people in any way to die, to just be with them where they're at. And it was just, it took her about a decade to, go through the process of figuring out what happened. But when she did, it was, she's still doing the work now, and it's very, turned out to be a very beautiful but difficult experience. And I think she became so empathetic in the world that the pain of the world is really affects her, as well as the joy of knowing that the ultimate transition is a beautiful one. I just wanted that experience of her.
Well, thank you for, yeah, I really appreciate that. It can be really difficult for people who have had these transcendent experiences, and then they come back into this world, and especially if you're very sick, because your body might be experiencing a lot of suffering, and then you have a near-death experience and you're not suffering, but you come back and then your body's still not fully healed necessarily, although sometimes spontaneous healings can happen. But it's difficult. It's very difficult to make that shift. And if you aren't in a situation where caregivers are familiar with it, then they're just telling you, oh, it was the drugs, you just hallucinated it, or, really not validating the experience, which now certainly in hospice, it is so well known that near-death experiences are very real, that deathbed visitations are real. Whole host of experiences at end of life are, for the person who's experiencing them, they're real, and therefore they should be validated. But the International Association of Near-Death Experiencers has also done an awful lot to try to support people around the globe, because oftentimes not only is it a life-changing experience, but then it changes the course of a person's life in a dramatic way. So how can you support someone that, say, was a high-powered advertising executive? One person I talked to was, running a hugely successful company. He gave it all away and started doing volunteer work in his community. And people thought he was crazy, but he's like, no, this is, I've made enough money. This is what I want to do. This is my true heart's desire. People thought he was nuts. Then he went on and continues to do really great things in his community. So that's pretty dramatic, the kind of life path change, like what you just described with the Bernadette Foundation. That's huge shift, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Jay has his hand raised, and then Chaim.
Jay?
Hi, yeah. First of all, maybe on a little bit more lighthearted note, but in the movie, the figure who was the sort of Christ figure in a couple of people's experiences there, I was having flashbacks to Jeff Bridges as the dude in The Big Lebowski, right? In the, the bathrobe with the sandals, and I was waiting for him to say, "You can abide here." But back to the conversation, I too was struck by, and I have been struck by, NDEs and the psilocybin effects and enlightenment, right? The descriptions of enlightenment being, again, without in the NDEs, not meeting people from our past or welcoming us and all of that, but to be transported or to find oneself in a place that just everything is illuminated and at peace and comfort, and they don't want to really leave. And people can have the same sort of thing with the psilocybin and from the descriptions I've read of people who are enlightened. But as you pointed out, I guess while all of those, while the NDE isn't very attractive to me, but perhaps the psilocybin experience might be. But that in part is why I practice, right? Is an attempt to have something that's more sustainable. And I do recall, as I'm saying that too, that's what Ram Dass ended up saying. Like, he did all the acid he could, but he always came down. And so he ended up, following a path of, this path in order to have something that was more sustainable. And, but I too was struck by that. It sounds like kind of a common experience where our ego is gone and we're not, as Aldous Huxley described it, right? We don't have this big, what did he call it? A minimizing valve, or, something that just took all of the information and beauty and experience of the universe and funneled it into our little world. That disappears, right? And so I don't know. Again, I thought that was interesting as well.
Thank you.
This is just back to your comment about Jeff Bridges, is that had a lot of fun with our animator on this, because that's actually a hybrid of Jason Momoa and Jeff Bridges in The Big Lebowski. So
Chaim had his hand up too.
Hi, Johanna. Thank you. I haven't seen the film yet, but I plan to see it now after listening to this. Let's see. I had a couple of things. I looked through the website. How did you get Anthony Hopkins to do your Instagram post? That was neat. Just a couple of days ago.
I know. I actually don't do my Instagram posts, and I don't know.
Okay.
I've had COVID, so the staff was having a little fun with me. I don't quite know what's happened yet. I go back to work tomorrow.
Well, I'm glad you're better. I
Thank
was
you.
thinking about medical care and the way that medicine can keep us alive today, past our due date, so to speak. And thinking about Stephen Jenkinson, who is my favorite on this topic. And he talks so much about like the urgent need, for us to have this conversation. And from what I've seen, of children who are unwilling to let go of their parents, or other situations, because they, we don't have an idea about that death is okay. And so that was on my mind. And I'm surprised to hear you talking about NDEs. It is becoming, there's the Raymond Moody book, Leslie Kean, and a few others, but it's still mostly in the realm of UFOs, and telepathy, and I take it very seriously. And so, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned mushrooms. There's so much more here, and these stories, that these anecdotes that happen to individuals of a breakthrough, of a crossing over experience, are wonderful and terrifying. But what can we learn? What do we know? What does this tell us about what we are? And finally, there is a link here with the UFO experience. I think that's important too, to keep in mind, together with the mushroom, the DMT, and the NDEs. These are all these kind of occult type things are linked somehow. So I'm wondering your thoughts.
Well, I don't know about the UFO situation, but I do know that with near-death experiences, some of these other end-of-life experiences that people have that are quite well documented, and the research that's been done now for 100 years with different drugs that induce non-ordinary states, that these are all things that human beings seem to be receptive. We seem to have the capacity for these experiences because of our biology, if you will. The brain does produce DMT. We have receptors for different psychotropic drugs. We don't reject them. There's a place for those substances, the molecular makeup of them, to connect with the human body. So we have you might say, as Anthony Bossis did in the film, we seem to be wired as human beings for these experiences. And throughout cultures, non-ordinary states have been something common to all culture. And certainly in meditative traditions, these experiences, what we would call non-ordinary experiences, happen. It'd be called cities, or different things in different traditions. And so to me, what I think is interesting is that human beings are capable of things that we, in this age and in these times, have utterly and completely downplayed, right? What we value are things that are material, that are measurable. And yet my dog, when we go out for a walk in the woods, she smells things that I can't smell. She sees a whole range of color and different wavelengths that I don't see. She's having whole experiences here that are totally different than me. And I am barely using my senses, right? This is why a lot of urban dwellers are very interested in taking classes and tracking and going into the woods and expanding their sensory perceptions, because we don't use them. So I think all of these end-of-life experiences really point to our humanity as something more extraordinary than we realize. And I think that's why the question of consciousness is so appealing to me, because we are so much more. And that's the great mystery, right? I'm so glad you brought it up. Thank you.
Trip has his hand up, or did?
I do. Thank you so much for doing this tonight. I watched the film this morning. I have shared it with a couple of people who I thought might be interested. I'm in Southwest Georgia. And the only reason I share that is that we're in a very, very deeply Christian part of the country. And I'll just speak openly. I consider myself to be a student of Buddhism. I'm very happy to be on the path. I was raised as an Episcopalian, but here Jesus is the gatekeeper. He's the decider. Get in or you get out, right? And so what struck me this morning was there were a couple of people who were interviewed who really, it was clear that Jesus, or a figure of Jesus, was the one who told them, hey, you're not ready yet. But regardless if it's Jesus or if it's an elder or an uncle or an aunt, I'm curious in the NDEs, I would assume, but I don't want to assume, some people don't have a decider or a guide who sends them back. And Karen Sue, I've never actually asked you this question, but the idea of going and then coming back kind of on your own versus having somebody who points you back. And I'm just curious what your take is on that, both of you, all of you, because it was very striking this morning. The thought of somebody a being, a greater being, making a decision on one's behalf.
Yeah, that gatekeeper. I have never heard a story that didn't involve what some people in the business refer to as a welcoming party, or a welcoming somebody, some not necessarily human form. Some could be your dog. You know,
But there was
always
something communicating, going back. It was never just coming back.
That part of it. Well, sometimes it has been conveyed to me as a knowing. So it wasn't that somebody said something as much as, and I knew that I just felt, I knew there was this line and I couldn't go any further. So it wasn't a decider in that sense, but there was just some knowing. If it wasn't some, kind of an auditory experience, then there was some kind of knowing. This is as far as I can go.
Thank you.
We're going to have to end soon.
I think I have shared that. Oh, sorry.
I was saying, okay, go ahead, Karen.
Sorry. I'm just going to quickly tell Tripp, and I think I've said this before, the end of my experience was that I drifted away from the earth and was seeing the earth get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And then that was the end of my experience. And I came back. So for what that's worth, that was the end of my experience.
So we are going to have to end soon. I just wanted to ask you one last question, Johanna. Could you say something about the next two films? Do you have plans?
Yes. The next film is called Saying Goodbye, Preparing for Death. And this film, it'll be out this fall, really looks at really just the things that we should be aware of, the issues that we should be aware of when, thinking about our end of life. A lot of us think that I'm going to be like I am right now, and then I'll be dead. But the truth is, it's a process. If we have the good fortune of going through old age, it is a process. And so there are many decisions, many steps of the way. And the film is kind of looking at that, of preparing for death, looking at what the process is, and, along the way saying, well, what do I want? Helping to guide those questions, and often some of the lesser considered issues. So that's the second one. And the third one, which will be out shortly after that, probably early 23, is called The Architecture of Death, the inner world of dying. And those really are the last weeks, days, hours of death. And what does that look like? And that's both for the person who's dying, as well as how the family constellation changes, and a lot of those interpersonal things.
Well, thank you. This has really been just fabulous.
Can I just acknowledge Joanna on how she made that film? It just loved the variety of the interviewers and the visuals, and even from animation. I just thought the quality was stupendous. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Any other urgent last messages?
Thank you.
Well, it's been an incredible honor to be with you all today, and I'm so grateful that you watched the film, and it's really meant for conversation. It's really meant to generate perhaps fresh ideas, a fresh take. And above all, it's meant to be validating in your life, that death is not a separate part of our life, because really death happens all the time, just not necessarily the big D death. We'll have all those little deaths, you know, the end of a relationship, the end of a job, the end of my ability to do something I used to be able to do yesterday and I can't do today. We have lots of little deaths that are happening all the time. So we might as well really roll it all into one big celebration of our humanity.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So we always close with a couple of chants that having to do with the dedication of merit and also a wish for peace in the world. Meg, are you ready to lead us?
I was going to take over for the end.
You are? Okay. I'll just put them on screen. You can do them or not as you wish. I'm going to mute everybody because otherwise we get cacophony. And here they come. That isn't it. I hope I'm going to be able to do this. There we go.
By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times, and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigden's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Joanna.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Sarah, thank
Fantastic.
you. Thank you, Joanna.
Fascinating. Good night, everyone.
Thank
Thank you, Karen, Sue,
Thank you.
Kurt,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you,
Johanna.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everybody.
Jane.
And Johanna, thank you so much.
Ellen.
Johanna, thank you.
Wonderful.
Meg,
Really
Gary,
wonderful.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Jay, everyone.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Beautiful.
Really, very important. Thank you.
I remember Trungpa Rinpoche. Oh, wait, I'm going to stop this recording.